All right, everybody, welcome back. Good morning to you guys. Sorry to get it started a little close to the class time period, but just in the nick of time. It's about 11:10 a.m. and today we are going to continue having the next lecture in our series. It's an important lecture today because it's all about the fallacies of relevance, which are the ones that are used for the homework assignment that's going to be due next class period. So, pay good attention, take clear notes. These are the pieces of information that you do need to do well on the homework because the homework is just about the fallacies of relevance. It's not about the fallacies of ambiguity that we covered last Thursday. It's not about the fallacies of unwarranted assumption that we're going to cover this next class period on Thursday this week. So the homework that you guys have to turn in this next class on the, what day is that, 9th? It's just about the fallacies that are used in today's lesson. So it's a key lesson for the fact that it does have to do with your homework. So with that all in place, let's just go ahead and get started. I'm just pulling up my class syllabus here in my phone so that I've got it handy as a reference for all of you guys. And I hope you're all doing really well. Hope that you guys are having a nice, healthy, and safe semester at home for now. We all, wish that we could be there face-to-face and have our typical class meetings. So I really do feel for you guys, going through your college experience and having to deal with this disruption. But we're all in it together, and we're going to get through it better than ever. And I'm here to help in every way that I possibly can. So just understand this. The next couple of classes, you're going to turn in your homework number 2 to me by class time on Thursday. With the midterms that you guys did last week, I'm just about done grading those, and I will be finished later tonight. So I'm just going to send an announcement by Canvas in the morning tomorrow that anybody can ask me for their grade. They can do a grade check and request the comments that you would have on any individual student exam. So basically, you can check for your score on the midterm starting tomorrow morning. Many of them are done, but I just have a couple that I still have to mark up. Anyways, they're going to be done, so you can ask for your scores tomorrow by email. I like to reply individually to students so that I can give you your own photocopy, scanned copy of the pages that I wrote comments on. So feel free, once I send the announcement in the morning tomorrow, to go ahead and ask for your midterm score. Then you're just turning in your homework this Thursday. And we do have a quiz to follow on the next Tuesday meeting next week. That's all about fallacies, just about chapter 5. So it's not going to be based on just the one section, but all 20 fallacies that we're going to learn. Okay, so good to see you there, Sebastian. Anybody else, if you guys want to chime in, just tap in a couple of lines so that I see who's here. It's always good to see a few usernames and get a sense of who's viewing. But whether you're watching live now or whether you're going to watch this later, good to see all you guys and be in touch with all my students. So, hi there, Maison, Bill, Madison, and all you others. Good to hear from you guys and see you here. We're all kind of in the same boat, right? Just doing our work from home now, me and you and everyone else in the country. So anyways, it's back to chapter 5. And chapter 5 is all about fallacies. All right, fallacies. So that's our subject today. Hey there, Connor. Fallacies are when there are logical flaws or errors within an argument. And because of those errors and flaws, it makes it so that it's a bad argument. The premises don't provide the proper type of support to the conclusion. And when you spot a fallacy, you're definitely supposed to just call it out and tell a person this is a bad argument, it's invalid. Hi, Veronica. It's invalid because it commits this given fallacy. And over the centuries, over the millennia, different fallacies have been identified and given names. And we're just trying to become familiar with them, get our vocabulary up and learn what these terms mean and how to utilize these concepts in everyday life when we engage with arguments, ideas, information that we hear from whatever source, whether that's your friends, teachers, media, or authority figures of whatever kind. So we're learning fallacies. The first category of fallacies that we studied on last Thursday were called fallacies of ambiguity, okay? And there were 5 of those specifically. So fallacies of ambiguity, just for review, are the type of fallacies that are involved when you've got ambiguous words, sloppy grammar, or a confusion between two similar concepts. And there's a range of different examples of fallacies of ambiguity. So the first one we talked about was let's see which one came first, the equivocation fallacy. Okay, so if you remember, equivocation is the fallacy that happens when there's a word that has different meanings and it's used more than once in the argument, but the problem is that the meaning changes. So the word equivocates, or we equivocate on the meaning of that word. So, you know, if I tell you that I love to box, and when it's holiday season, we all get to box up our gifts, so that must mean I love the holidays. That might not necessarily be an accurate conclusion if I'm using what term in two different ways. Let's see if you have a guess. I'm a big fan of boxing, so when there's boxes to put together, I love that. Yes, exactly. Boxing, you could say, is a sport, right? And I actually do kind of like boxing sometimes. I like watching boxing matches if they're good. But anyway, to say that and then to introduce a second premise, which speaks of boxing in a different sense, namely boxing up items that you want to give away as presents, that's to use the same word boxing or box in different senses. And it doesn't mean the same thing, even though the word looks and sounds the same. So that would be one case, perhaps, of equivocation. And that happens a lot. Sometimes you might sign on the dotted line of a contract thinking that you know what you're getting into, but you didn't read the fine print, or you didn't see how the terms were clearly defined and you had a different misunderstanding of them. Yeah, that's true, I guess, wrapping music versus gifts, but it's kind of a different spelling, so it's not exactly the same. That has a phonemic similarity because the word sounds exactly the same. To rap, like, up jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogity beat, the old Sugar Hill Gang type of stuff. That's rapping like on stage, rapping in music. That's with R-A-P-P-I-N-G, but rapping like wrapping a gift, W-R-A-P-P-I-N-G. This is a different word. So it wouldn't actually be a perfect example of that. Keep that in mind. Different spelling means it's not actually the same sequence of letters. So equivocation only happens when the word's spelled the exact same way, not just when it sounds the same. But that's a good thing to mention, and I'm glad that I saw the comment. So anyway, that's equivocation. Another one that we talked about on Thursday was amphiboly. So amphiboly is when there's a grammatical ambiguity that makes it so that you don't know what the meaning of the statement was, or it leads to multiple interpretations. So if I said that, let's see, the crowd, had, let's see, I'm trying to think of a plural ambiguity. So how about this? The dogs were chasing after the cats, and they were excited. Or maybe I shouldn't say that because it's more implied that it would be the dog. What's something that's neutral between the dogs and the cats in the scenario? The dogs were chasing after the cats, and they were brown. There you go. Now, how's that ambiguous? The dogs were chasing those cats, and they're brown. We don't know which word, which word refers to. The term in that example would be what? The dogs were chasing the cats. You hear my example. And they were brown. Why is that amphiboly? Why is that an ambiguous sentence right there? Because it's unclear which things the word they refers to. Good. That's a plural pronoun, they. And we've got two different cases of plural subjects there. There's the dogs mentioned, plural. There's also the cats being chased by the dogs, plural. And the word they, we're not sure to whom it attaches. Is it in reference to the dogs or in reference to the cats? Are these brown dogs chasing cats, or are these brown cats being chased by the dogs? It's just kind of not clear. So there would be amphiboly. Good. Good feedback from you. After that, we talked about the fallacy of accent, right? And the fallacy of accent happens when an emphasis or stress is placed on a word or phrase in a statement or an argument, and what that causes to happen is it changes the intended meaning of the statement. So like in the example from the book, the mother is upset at the daughter for setting fire to the house. And she says, I told you don't ever play with matches. What are you doing? And the child says, I know, but you said don't play with matches. That's technically I wasn't playing. I mean, what I did was like science or something. I'm combusting objects to see how flames work. That's obviously to misunderstand the parents' rule, because when they said don't play with matches, it means obviously don't do anything involving them, don't touch them, not just don't create games and so on. So that would be one example of accent, and others could be mentioned. Then at the end, we talked about division and composition. So this first part of our meeting today, I'm just reviewing. So division is the fallacy that happens when you start with a claim about what a group is like or some collective, and then you divide down to the case of each individual part or member of it and say that it has the same feature. But that's not always true. So, if there's a loud family, it doesn't mean that each family member is loud. If there's a wealthy country, it doesn't mean that each individual citizen of the country is wealthy, okay? If you have a big hotel, it doesn't mean every room that's a part of it is big. So that would be all, division examples. And then composition is very similar, but in the opposite direction. So with composition, we start off with one claim about an individual that's a part of a larger group or collection. And then we say that the whole composite has the same feature that the parts do. But that's not always true. Sometimes the whole is different than each part. So the United States, let's say this, one person is poor and they're a citizen of the US, but that doesn't mean that the United States is poor. One person is loud and they're a member of a family, but that does not mean that the family is loud. One room in a hotel is small, but it doesn't mean that the whole hotel as a total thing is small. So that would be composition, to start with an assumption or a claim about a part, and then to draw an illegitimate inference that the whole is the same as the part is. Okay, so that was just some brief summary of last lecture, and now we're going to move ahead. We're staying on the same chapter and topic, which is fallacies. That's chapter 5. And now we're moving on to the second category of fallacies, which are called fallacies of relevance. Okay, so let me put that up here, and then we'll go over the concept of that. Okay, so fallacies of relevance, that's the topic of the day. Now, what's up with these fallacies is that they happen within arguments when one or more of the premises of the argument is irrelevant or unrelated to the conclusion. Okay, so that's the definition of the concept. Let me put it here. When one or more of the premises of the argument are irrelevant or unrelated, is irrelevant or unrelated to the conclusion. All right, fallacies of relevance. So yes, when one or more of the premises within the argument are not related to or are irrelevant to the conclusion of the argument. So when you have a good argument, right, the premises provide solid backing and support for the conclusion. They establish that the conclusion is either necessarily or probably true. But if you have a fallacy of relevance within the argument, then the premises don't have any kind of real relationship to the conclusion which establishes that it's true. So that's the problem with these fallacies. The premises don't give a relevant reason to believe that the conclusion is true. And we're going to learn about, let me see how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 8 of these, 8 of these fallacies of relevance that we're going to go over today. So if you think about it, on Thursday last week, starting with fallacies, we went through 5 of them. Equivocation, amphibly, accent, division, composition. And then today we're learning 8 more, so 8 plus 5 is 13. And then Thursday this week, next class, we're going to learn 7 more, which are the third category. Those are called fallacies of unwarranted assumption. So by the time we're done with this topic in chapter 5, there's 20 fallacies overall, basically, that we're needing to know. But we're focused on the 8 for today, okay? So is everybody with me? Let's go ahead and start talking about the 8 different fallacies of relevance. What I'm going to do first, just so that we can kind of get all those things on the table, I'm going to write down the names of the 8 that we're going to cover, and then after you see the names for your notes and stuff, I'm going to start at the top and just go through the definitions and examples for each one at a time. Okay, so there's definition of fallacies of relevance. Now I'm going to erase this, and then I'm going to put down the names of the 8 topics that fall under its scope for today. All right. Okay, so I'm putting down the names of the 8 fallacies of relevance that we all want to know. First off, there's one called personal attack. Something to know about personal attack, and we're going to go over this. Thanks, Veronica. One thing that you want to know is that it also has a secondary name that it sometimes also goes by. Just kind of like how earlier in the semester when I taught you about modus ponens, sometimes it's known as affirming the antecedent, or that modus tollens is known as denying the consequent. Okay, well, personal attack is one way that this is titled, but it's sometimes also known by its older Latin name, which is ad hominem. So I'm going to put that in parentheses below so you can see both. Ad hominem. So that's the older Latin name of this fallacy. It's been around a long time. Ad hominem means to the man. Hominem is the man. So instead of replying to the argument, you're attacking the person who made the argument. But we're going to go over that in a moment in more depth. Just anyway, the first one's called personal attack / ad hominem, aka ad hominem. Okay, now the second one, appeal to force. And now appeal to force fallacy also has a alternative title. So sometimes it's called, and this is also written in a book, it's also sometimes called the scare tactic fallacy. So I'll put that here, scare tactics. Okay, and next, there is appeal to pity fallacy. That's a third case, appeal to pity. All right, then there's popular appeal. Okay, then we've got what's called appeal to ignorance. Okay, and then 3 more. So hopefully that you can see this on the bottom here. Next, it's hasty generalization. Okay, and then 2 more. Next, I'm going to put over here straw man. Okay. And then the 8th and last for today is called red herring. All right, so our goal, our mission today, hey Carmen, is just to go over these 8 pieces of info, to learn what these terms mean, to understand examples of them, such that if you were asked what is an example of the appeal to force fallacy, you could give an example. Or if you saw an example, you could identify it by the name that you see here. Fallacy, so everyone is clear, it's one of the most fundamentally basic topics in this type of class, critical thinking, intro to critical thinking. So it's not unique to me or my class. If you study this subject anywhere, under anybody, this is always going to be a major unit in this course because informal fallacies are fundamental to learning critical thinking and to being a good reasoner and writer. This is a topic that has been studied and understood for a long time, going back thousands of years even, so you're part of a big tradition now. Anyways, 8 fallacies of relevance, and we're going to start off with the one at the top here. We're going to go over all of them. You're going to learn the definitions of each one, but we are going to take it one at a time. So starting with the beginning, personal attack, or if you like, the ad hominem fallacy. Okay. And, as I've said before, and it's always an open invitation to anybody, if you ever have any questions or comments or things that you want me to go back over, repeat, or explain on, elaborate further, I'm always looking at the chat bar, and I'm happy to go back over things. John, you say this: are the fallacies of division and composition related to hasty generalization? Okay, let me save your question for a moment because it's a good question. It has to do with a similarity, I think, that you may be noticing between the composition fallacy and hasty generalization. They do actually bear certain similarities. Division, not so much, because division doesn't make a conclusion about a general class of things. It makes a conclusion about a single member of a class. But you are correct to note that there seem to be some general similarities or overlap between the idea of composition and hasty generalization. But let's keep that in mind. And when I get to hasty generalization in a bit, I will come back to your question, which is a good one. Okay, so personal attack, everybody, ad hominem. What fallacy is that? Okay, so this is the fallacy that is committed when, say, somebody does not agree with the conclusion of somebody's argument. But instead of trying to rebut the argument by providing a logical counter-argument, instead they just attack the person themselves who made the argument. So, I'm going to open my book really fast. So, yeah, instead of replying to an argument, one attacks the character or circumstances of the person who made the argument, okay? Instead of providing a logical counter-argument, one attacks the person who provided the argument. Okay, so that's personal attack fallacy, ad hominem. Let me give you some examples of that. There's so many examples. This is a fallacy that's, sad to say, committed by a lot of people. Sometimes even people in high positions of authority are susceptible to committing this fallacy, but we should not do it ourselves, and we should not take the bait if others do it to us. So, for example, suppose that someone was having a little, debate about policy. Maybe one person has the view that, the harm to the economy from the pandemic shutdown is so significant that we ought to reopen the economy regardless of whatever public health concerns there may be. Someone makes that argument to another person. And suppose that the individual who hears this argument says, well, you know what? I mean, that's a ridiculous claim. And the only reason you're making it is because you're ugly. You're an ugly person. And so obviously you don't know what you're talking about. But think about it, right? Does the person's physical appearance, whatever it is, have anything to do with rejecting their claim? No. In that case, you're not even attacking their argument or trying to establish what's wrong with what they have claimed. You're making it personal. You're talking about them in personal terms, but this is irrelevant, isn't it, to the conclusion that they've provided. Another, millions of examples. Someone says, look at all this data. I've studied the issue, and I see that according to the most reliable reports from science, we have a heating trend, an accumulation of greenhouse gases on this planet. Don't you think that maybe we should try and take some steps to mitigate that over the next century? And the other person says, no way, I don't agree with you at all, because basically, look, I mean, do you even know how to dress? Look at your outfit right now. You look terrible. Or your breath smells, buddy, so I don't think you know what you're saying. Look, if you say those kind of things to the person, you're really not refuting their argument. If anything, it's undermining the credibility of your own argumentative position, because it makes it seem like when you're challenged on a belief that other people don't share with you, or when people hold ideas that are contrary to yours, instead of standing up and telling them why your views are irrational and giving some kind of evidence or basis to support yourself, you just lash out at people, start attacking them, insulting them, calling them names or whatever. And that's just not a rational way to argue. If a person does that, the best thing to do is to say, look, that's a personal attack. Do you have a rebuttal? Do you have a response? I mean, you're attacking me, but you haven't shown why what I'm saying is false. So sometimes, people don't like another person's position or claim or conclusion, but they don't give a reason why it's wrong, and they just attack the individual. But that's not relevant, so that's a fallacy. Let me give you some examples that are also from our book. And so just some text from the book. The ad hominem fallacy, or personal attack, occurs when we disagree with someone's conclusion, but instead of presenting a counter-argument, we attack the person that made the argument. Okay, look at this. So in 2015, when Kentucky clerk Kim Davis refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, some of her critics said, well, how can you say that after you've had 3 divorces? How can you do that when you've had 3 divorces? But that's talking about her own marital history as a reason why her position could not possibly be legitimate. But you're supposed to basically ignore the circumstances and character of the individual who give the argument and treat it as though the argument's coming down from an anonymous source. It really doesn't matter who it is that has provided the argument. It's the argument itself that is to be analyzed and critiqued, not the person. So, you know, if you say you're a hypocrite, you're telling us we can't get married, but you've already had many divorces. Maybe the person is a hypocrite, doing one thing and saying another, but you're only supposed to look at what they're saying. Their own behavior can be criticized for being inconsistent with their stated views, but that doesn't make their argument invalid in and of itself. Other examples here. So sometimes they divide it into 2 subcategories. Abusive is when you just attack the character of the person. Circumstantial is when you dismiss their argument because of the circumstances they're in. So like, for example, so say somebody's thinking, yeah, we got to really keep this business environment shut down for a while longer to provide for public safety due to the virus. And the other person says, oh, come on, that's not true. You're only saying that because you're unemployed. Now, that's making the response that their argument is invalid because the one who has stated it, their circumstances are that they don't work. So the idea is like, they don't really care if the economy is shut down because they didn't have a job anyway. But we're supposed to look at their argument in and of itself, disregard the fact of this person's employment status, and consider whether or not it is wise, based on evidence, to draw this conclusion from the premises that they gave. Okay? Let's see. Ernest believes in the existence of extraterrestrial life. He's just insane, you know, but that rebuttal doesn't really give an argument why his view is wrong. It just attributes to him, you know, insanity or mental illness. But does this show a reason why his claim is illegitimate or is not likely to be correct? It doesn't. Another example from the book, I'm just going over some text. Pat and Chris, let's imagine these are 2, I don't know if you want to call them friends, but they're 2 people having a discussion about the policy of abortion and access to abortion service. So Pat says this, I think abortion's wrong because it ends the life of a living human being. Chris comes back and says, well, no, I mean, you're just a bunch of narrow-minded religious fanatics. Okay, so he's getting into a personal level of critique here. He's just calling the person names and attributing their view to some type of religious fundamentalism. And then Pat comes back, oh yeah, well, you're just an anti-life, baby-killing Nazi. How do you like that? So this whole conversation in this case has gone off the rails, right? It's just descended into mutual name-calling and chest-pounding about these insults. And that's not what you're supposed to do when you're having a rational argument. So it's sometimes tough when people are attacking you on a personal level to not just take the bait and get down into the gutter with them and say, well, you know what, if you're calling me a Nazi, blah, 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 I'm going to, you know, tell you, you know, blah, 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 all about yourself. But you're really just undermining your own position further if you do that. It's better not to get down into the gutter with a person who's making personal attacks and just note it. Say, you don't have an argument, you're just attacking me, but where's the argument? I'd love to know if you have a better reason why what I'm saying is false. So attack me all you like, but you really haven't justified your stance. Another example from our book, just going through it. Of course, Raul is in favor of affirmative action. He's Latino, and he'll benefit from those programs. Well, this is another example of pointing out the person's racial heritage as a disqualifying factor for their argument in favor of affirmative action. But if affirmative action is an unsound policy, then there have to be reasons that don't refer to one individual named Raul as to why it's unsound. And you would report on those reasons, not attack the individual who's making the case. Father and son. Father sees the son smoking, says, son, come on, why are you doing that? We all know smoking is really bad for your health. That's the argument of the father. Son says, but come on, look who's talking. Don't you smoke a pack a day? Well, again, that's a personal attack. He's saying, you're a hypocrite. Don't tell me not to smoke when that's something that you yourself do. But does that hypocrisy of the father establish that smoking is safe or that there's something that's not dangerous about smoking? No. So those would all be fair examples of ad hominem personal attack fallacy. Let's see. And yeah, just don't take the bait. Don't reply in kind. Try and bring it to a higher level of discourse and direct the person back to the argument itself. If they're starting to flail around and attack you on a personal level, it kind of shows that they maybe don't have the courage of their convictions to justify and defend their own view without all that ad hominem attack. Okay, so that's one. Now we're going to go on and talk about our next. So I've given you the definition. We talked it over. Move to the next example. All right, so next up, it's appeal to force, or known as scare tactics also. Okay, so what is appeal to force? This is the fallacy of argument that happens when you use or threaten to use force, whether that's literal physical force or psychological or legal pressure or intimidation, to get someone to back down and to accept your viewpoint. So when we use or threaten to use force to get someone to back down and accept your position or accept your position. All right, that's appeal to force, the scare tactic fallacy. So sometimes people, when an argument is made, they don't like what the conclusion of it is. They don't like the argument someone is giving. But the problem is that some people, instead of saying why the argument is bad or trying to refute the claim, they will just use threats, intimidation, and scare tactics to get the person to reverse course or to change their mind and align with you. So sometimes when others have leverage over you, some kind of power or control over you, then they may be more susceptible to committing this fallacy because then they can use that as leverage. So for example, if you have parents or whatever that you are dependent upon, and suppose that you had like a disagreement with one parent or whoever about some political issue or something. You tell them that you think something that they don't believe could be like a disagreement on, I don't know, fiscal policy, social policy, immigration laws, distribution of wealth collected by tax, funding of public programs, whatever. So let's say you have a view, they don't agree. And, so the parent would say something like, I want you to stop talking all that stuff you say about global warming. If you want to, who pays your tuition? Don't forget that. Right now, if your parents say that to you, what's the implication of the statement? That you better not disagree with me or hold these contrary views, because if you do express them or if you do hold them, I'm going to threaten the revocation, the elimination of your tuition payments. Now, is that really giving a reason why this young person's argument is wrong? No. It's just saying, I'm going to use the threat or force, in this case, the implied revoking of payments as a way to get the person to back down or change their mind. You could also imagine even more like, straightforward cases. Someone says, I think that there should be, let's say, a consumer protection agency to ensure that banks don't game the system by creating a whole bunch of overdraft fees and stuff. And then someone who's really into finance says, you know what, if you keep saying that, I'm just going to punch you in the face. In that case, there's no attempt to even make a counter argument. It's literally the threat of force that's being used to try and intimidate the person into changing their mind. It could be your boss. It could be your boss saying, if you express those political opinions, you might just need to find a different place to work, if you can kind of catch my drift. So in all those cases, no attempt at rational persuasion has been made. Instead, it's getting into do this or else, pretty much, or believe this, take this opinion, or else. So you're supposed to try and convince people of the truth of your positions, not just to browbeat, intimidate, or threaten them into that. And if a person did, let's say, modify their views just because they were afraid that you'd make good on a threat, how satisfied could you really be? It's not like they came to the conclusion on their own judgment that that was correct. Instead, they're just trying to avoid some type of harm or disadvantage. And that's not, I don't think, intellectually satisfying to a logical person. Don't disagree with me or I'll slap you. Don't disagree with me or I'll fire you, or, and on and on. Sometimes scare tactics can be used to exaggerate the threat of something. So someone will say, don't accept this policy, because if you do, horrible, nightmarish, dystopian consequences will follow from it. So sometimes overhyped predictions of disaster could be seen in line with this fallacy of appeal to force. And it's mentioned in the book. People who have political, financial, or social power are more likely to use the appeal to force fallacy. Although most of us are not taken in by overt threats of force, fear is a powerful motivator, and one that we are more likely to fall for than we may realize. This is particularly troublesome when those who lack power, for example, battered women or oppressed minorities, come to agree with their oppressor or blame themselves for their own oppression. Furthermore, children who witness abuse may come to believe that might makes right and identify with the person in power. So might does not make right. The threat of force, whether real or implied, is not any way to go about life making the case for the views that you hold. So let people come to their conclusions based on rational argumentation, but once you start threatening or using the appeal to force fallacy, you're going off the rails, and it's not a good way socially, I think, either to make friends and win allies. So that's the next one. That's appeal to force. One thing I'll mention, though, quickly in passing, and this is, I think, relevant to your homework. So a couple of the homework examples don't involve any fallacy. And sometimes there could be a statement that at least appears to be an appeal to force fallacy, but really it's not. So, for example, if you warn somebody of something dangerous that they should not do, that might not be appeal to force if the warning is rationally supported. So like if I tell somebody, don't drink and drive, because if you do, you very well could get into an accident causing injury or death to either yourself or other people. That's not a scare tactic fallacy. It's not saying don't drink or drive or else I will do something. It's saying don't drink or drive because that logically leads to the higher incidence of such accidents. So whether or not the forewarning of a negative result is justified by evidence distinguishes the case of an actual appeal to force fallacy from a legitimate warning. So if I tell you don't go out right now into a big public place because you could get this virus, that's not really a scare tactic fallacy, because it's not I'm the one that's leveraging some control over you by threatening you. I'm just informing you in that case of a realistic danger that I'm not the source of. So anyways, hopefully that does make some clear sense to you. Sometimes we can warn people of things that are dangerous, scary, or whatever, and that's not necessarily an appeal to force fallacy. It's appeal to force when you, the one who threatens, is the agent of the harm that they could face, right? Okay, so we're gonna go on to the next case. If everyone's with me, let's talk about the third, which is appeal to pity. Okay, so appeal to pity. This one's, I think, one of the easier ones to understand. So it's basically when pity is invoked in an argument, but it's not relevant to the conclusion or situation. All right. So when pity is invoked in an argument, but is irrelevant to the conclusion. So basically, an easy way to think about this definition or idea is that it's the type of fallacy that is committed when somebody wants others to feel sorry for them or somebody else, and is just using that feeling of sympathy or pity as the way to justify a conclusion. But if it's the appeal to pity fallacy, then the invocation of pity is not warranted and it's not relevant to the real situation at hand. So, I mean, one example that's used in the book, which is an easy case to think about, is like, take the case of a traffic officer who pulls someone over for speeding. They pull the person over, they're giving them the ticket, but let's imagine that the driver says this, you know, officer, please, could you just not give me this ticket today? I would love it if you could just feel a little sorry for me, show me some pity, because I watched this really sad movie last night. It was just really a depressing film, and I'm still shook from that, and I'm still kind of going through it in my mind, and I'm just kind of in a disordered mental state this morning. That's the reason I was distracted on the road driving too fast. So can't you kind of give me a break? But in this case, obviously, the request for sympathetic treatment or consideration is really irrelevant. It doesn't matter that the person saw a sad movie, which is causing them some discomfort. Does that change the fact that they were in violation of the traffic laws? No. And you can imagine other substitutes for that. My goldfish died, and I'm dealing with a tough one. Or, you know, my boyfriend or girlfriend just broke up with me, and you know, I'm dealing with some of the emotional turmoil from that. In any of these examples mentioned with connection to the traffic situation, those are not justified excuses for the violation of the law. So hopefully that makes sense. It's appeal to pity. Now, I'm a professor, and sometimes I see examples of this when students need or would like accommodation for like late assignments or work that they didn't submit. So let's see, Veronica, you're saying this. So why didn't you pay your rent? You don't understand, I'm upset. My brother's neighbor's father died. Yeah, something like that. That would be a fair example, you know. So something that is either too remote from a rational assessment of what should be done for you. In such cases, the request for sympathy or pity is just kind of like an excuse trying to avoid personal responsibility or accountability for whatever the case is. This is an example from the book. I don't have time to type up my assignment for class tomorrow morning because I promised I'd meet my friend at the movies tonight. And you know better than anybody that you should not break promises. So can you please give me an extension? I mean, that's the reason I didn't do it. I had a scheduled movie night with a buddy. Now, of course, this is not really a very good reason to request the extension. And we can imagine any number of other substitutes for that example. Now, here's an important point also, as I mentioned in the last example. There could be some cases where a person's request for sympathetic consideration is justified, right? So, like in the case of this book, they gave another traffic ticket scenario. So suppose person speeding, cop pulls them over, and this is the way the interaction happens. Cop says, okay, I'm gonna have to write you a ticket. You're going like 15 miles per hour faster than the speed limit. And they say, okay, but hold on, this is an emergency. Look in the back seat. I have a toddler back there. They're choking right now. They're choking on a nickel that they swallowed, and I don't have the money or time to wait for an emergency ambulance. So that's why I'm breaking the traffic laws and going too fast. Now you might say, okay, in this situation, the urgent need for medical treatment for the child kind of outweighs the normal consideration in favor of giving the ticket. So if the student says, please give me an extension because I'm in the intensive care unit, I'm coming down with a serious illness, and this is a documented fact, that's not a request for pity. It's reached a level of severity in that case that it's justified and warranted to grant some reprieve from the typical rules. So just know that if it's like a lame, weak, flimsy excuse based on something trivial or insignificant, that is a more clear case of this fallacy. But of course, people have to be reasonable and grant some accommodation to people if the nature of their situation is dire enough. So just know that there can be those distinctions when it comes to examples of this particular fallacy. Okay. And that's what it says. Not all appeals to pity are fallacious. There are times when a person's plight calls for a sympathetic response. For example, please don't give me a speeding ticket, officer. My toddler is in the back seat, swallowed a nickel, having trouble breathing, and I have to get her to the hospital right away. In this case, we would consider the officer grossly insensitive and perhaps even criminally at fault if they gave the parent a speeding ticket instead of escorting him and his child to the hospital as quickly as possible. Okay, so appeal to pity. Sometimes it's done to us. Sometimes we commit it. You know, I don't know, you see some of these commercials that show you sad images of, like, I don't know, abused animals, and then they want you to donate. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with those agencies, but you could argue that maybe without more statistical data about the efficiency and nature of the aid and where it goes, that they may be making such an appeal. So anyways, let's make sure that when we listen to arguments that we are not just won over by the appeal to emotion or pity, and that when we deal with other people, we don't necessarily rely on this as a crutch to excuse ourselves from, you know, bad behavior or whatever. Okay, so that's appeal to pity, and we've gone over it. Now we're going to move on and start talking about the next, which is popular appeal. Okay, popular appeal. Okay, so popular appeal. That is when a person appeals to popular opinion to support their argument or conclusion. Okay. Popular appeal. When a person appeals to, invokes the popularity of a certain idea or claim in order to justify it. So you could also say this is called like the bandwagon approach, saying that because something's popular, it must be good or correct. So let's see some examples of this. You know, like if a person said iPhone is way better than Android, because if you just look at sales figures, there's more units of them that are sold, so it's a more popular item. Now, that's not a good argument. I mean, if it's better, and maybe it is, you know, you have to make the case why it deserves the popularity that it has earned based on, you know, its features, its ease of use, its, you know, being user-friendly and having a lot of good hardware and software within the phone. So, I mean, you wouldn't just say it's popular, so it must be the best. It's rather the other way around. Because it has these qualities, that's why it is deserved popularity. If things that were just popular were the best, then that would certainly lead us into a lot of incorrect conclusions. Like, you know, whatever's the #1 song on the radio must be the best song because most people are listening to it. But obviously, art criticism doesn't just say the most popular thing is the best. You say, my screen is blurry. What is the definition? Okay, thank you for your question. What it does say is popular appeal. When one appeals to popular opinion to support their conclusion. So you'll see that written there. I'm trying to say it's a little slower. You can always view this again too in a playback later because it stays online, but that's what it does say. When one appeals to popular opinion to support their conclusion. Thanks, Veronica, for typing it in there. Yeah, so we talked about iPhone. You know, what if someone said the #1 box office movie is the best movie? Wouldn't that be a kind of sad review? You open up, you know, the New York Times to try and get a sense of what this movie's all about, and they say #1 at the box office, best movie. And that wouldn't be a good argument. Here's another case mentioned in the book. So the vast majority, I mean, the majority of people have some kind of religious affiliation. I think in the United States, it's close to 90% divided between all the different major religions. But imagine that someone says this. So I've got an argument that God exists. God has to exist because most people believe in God. But that's not a good argument. You have to justify the claim that God exists. And there are rational arguments that attempt to prove that. Like there's what they call the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the argument from design. But it's a bad way to argue to just say, here's something that's true because most people believe it. If you go back in time, for example, and you look at, let's say, the distribution of public opinion 110, 120 years ago, most people in society would have said women shouldn't be voting. In America, it was 1920 that the Constitution was amended to allow women the right to vote. So, what would have been popular back in 1900, the first year of the 20th century, would have been that women shouldn't vote. But obviously, that's not necessarily true, and it's, I would say, definitively false. Or in the time of slavery, right? I mean, of course, if you had sampled the popular opinion of people in the society at that time, maybe a majority of people, at least for a time period, would have thought, oh, this is justified practice, it's always existed, and therefore it's not wrong. So obviously sometimes the popular position can be wrong, and therefore you have to do more to justify it than to just say it's currently popular. Sometimes people think of, fashion trends in the same way, like if everybody's wearing the Air Force One, then that must be a good shoe. No disrespect to that. I mean, I like to follow some of the fashion trends too, but the thing is, you'd like to consider the reasons why it has deserved that popularity if it does. Like, what makes it such a good shoe or whatever? What makes it so aesthetically pleasing? Of course, there can be cases where the popularity of something is the whole point. Like, I don't know, like if you wanted to attend a concert and nobody was there, you might say, well, that's going to be boring because no one's there. But in the general case, to establish that something is true, correct, or preferable, you have to make an independent argument that doesn't just specify that it's a popular thing. Sometimes this fallacy can also be seen when we rely on the popularity of like a famous endorsement figure or celebrity sponsor of a product. So sometimes this happens a lot within advertising, and that's something that we're going to talk about more as the class goes on, how fallacies are used in advertisement and marketing in a lot of cases. But if you see, like, I don't know, Tom Brady doing a commercial for Coca-Cola or something, you might say, well, this is such a popular athlete, so well known in our society and in the world, that must mean Coca-Cola is a great product. But whether it's good or not has to do with it itself, not with the popularity of who chooses to endorse it or who sponsors it or who's paid to give ad time for it. So in all those different cases, we're looking at the popular appeal fallacy, common fallacy that we see a lot in life. Okay, so going on then, I'm going to move to the next, erasing here. So now we're going to talk about appeal to ignorance. Appeal to ignorance is the next term. So this is a fallacy that happens when you argue that something is true only because it has not yet been proven false. Okay? When one argues that something is true, just because it has not been proven false. Okay, so that's the appeal to ignorance fallacy. It's when you're trying to claim something is true, but not because you have any evidence that actually backs it up. Instead, you're saying it's true just because there's no evidence that disqualifies it from being true. So like there's no proof that it's false. But that's not actually a substantial way to establish anything. For example, if I told you right now there have to be aliens out there in outer space, because why? If it's this fallacy. There must be aliens somewhere in the universe because why? If you follow the definition there. It's got to be life out there, and the reason is why. Let's see your attempt here. Appeal to ignorance. The claim is aliens exist. The reason given is what? That no one has proven that they don't exist, right? But that's not at all to establish the actual existence of the aliens. I mean, if we were going to prove they exist, then we would have to have evidence that demonstrates that they're real. I mean, we would actually have to have some type of physical or empirical evidence that we could look at that would establish their existence. But you can't say they exist because they have not been proven to not exist. So it's like, how could you prove a negative? You can't prove a negative. there's no way to prove something doesn't exist. What that would require, think about it, would be to somehow like canvas the entire physical universe, looking throughout each corner of it, which is physically impossible, and then somehow to verify on the basis of that search that there were no life. But this is not possible. So at the same time, this is a bad argument. Or if somebody says God must exist because no one's been able to prove that he doesn't exist. That's not proof of God's existence. We're not saying he doesn't, but that's not proof that he does. Proof that God exists would have to do with actual evidence that supports his existence, not the unavailability of contrary evidence. You know, like what if somebody said to you, if you're in a relationship or something, I think you've cheated on me. And the reason I believe it is because you can't prove that you haven't. Right? What would you do? I mean, there's nothing you could do at that point. You just have to say, well, I don't know. How can I give you proof that something that didn't happen didn't happen? So Veronica, your question is this: the only evidence we have is word of mouth and ideas, a video that has never been disproven. Well, look, there is no scientific evidence that establishes conclusively the existence of extraterrestrial life. The best argument you could give would be that statistically speaking, not based on empirical data that we've collected, but statistically speaking, the universe is so large and vast, and on this planet there's a lot of life. So the fact that there's life on this planet proves the case that it can exist in the universe. And so if it can exist once, you would think it could exist in other cases too. That's a bit more of a complex argument to give based on the general size of the universe and the likelihood that an event would recur more than once given the span of the physical universe. But that's not the same thing as saying that we actually have gotten evidence that indicates that they exist in a positive sense. John, you say this: is it the burden of proof where one makes a claim? It is their responsibility to uphold it, not make the other party disprove it. I guess you could see it in this way. If I'm making a claim, I have to provide support for it. I can't just say it's true unless you can show that it's false. So that is one fair way to look at it. Now, let me give you a couple other examples, maybe, if I see them here in the book. How about this? So I want to make a quick distinction, because you could look at that and you could think, but isn't that what we do in the court of law? We say that when a person is accused of a crime or charged with a crime, that they're considered innocent until proven guilty. So the claim is, the default assumption is innocence. And if you can't prove guilt, then we're going to go with innocence. Wouldn't that be appeal to ignorance? Like, I'm telling you I'm innocent unless you can prove otherwise. Well, here's the thing. That is a unique context, the context of criminal justice, because we honor this principle in our everyday lives when we're just thinking critically as rational human beings, but we don't want to apply this concept to the court of law, like saying you're not innocent unless you can prove you're innocent, because that would invite widespread judicial overreach, and it would, I think, undermine the liberties that we think we do have. We shouldn't make it so easy for the government to revoke a person's freedom, so that places the burden on the state to prove guilt. In everyday life, though, we don't say aliens exist unless proven otherwise. But in the context of criminal justice, we say we're going to grant you the presumption of innocence unless clear enough evidence can disqualify that presumption. So that's like a special exception to the rule here. The general rule in life is we don't assume that things are true until they can be disproven. We need proof before we can make the assessment that something's true. But because of how important it is that we preserve our liberties and not be able to be thrown in jail on weak or unsupported accusations, we require the state to meet this heavy standard of proof. To convict a person of a crime and take away their freedom, we have to make it so that innocence is the default presumption. But in everyday life, that's not so. It's not like the existence of aliens is a default until it gets disproven. But you being accused of a crime, we're going to bend over backwards to make it harder for the state to imprison you. So that would be one, perhaps, counterexample to the general truism of the appeal to ignorance fallacy. It's bad to make claims that something's true unless it's disproven, with the one exception of the court of law. John, you say this: I feel like it does make sense because normally the criminal is the defendant, so therefore a claim is made by the prosecutor and then evidence is shown to back it up. Well, the prosecutor brings the charge, and they have to convince the judge or jury, whatever, that that this person is guilty of the charge. So I guess what you're thinking is, for the belief of guilt to be established, they have to have proof, right? I'm only mentioning this because it's talked about in the book too, and some people might have been confused by it, thinking I'm being instructed that it's fallacious to believe something only because it hasn't been disproven. Well, doesn't that run contrary to the standard in law? But there is an exception to the general logical principle here, because we could not apply this principle in law without having an overly draconian legal system that would be too punitive. So as it says here, there's an important exception to the fallacy of appeal to ignorance in a court of law. A defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty, and the burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the defendant. The legal principle was designed to prevent punishment of the innocent, which is considered a much greater injustice than letting a guilty person go free. In addition, because the government is much more powerful than the individual, this principle helps level the playing field. It's important to note that a not guilty verdict is just that. It is not necessarily proof of the person's innocence. Okay, so good discussion, and thank you for your comments there, John. So I guess with that now, we can go on and talk about, there's just 3 more. So next up, it's hasty generalization. And we're doing well on time. We have enough time, so that's all good. All right, hasty generalization. Okay, cool. So what is hasty generalization? This is when a person makes a universal claim based on a sample that is either too small or biased. Okay, so I'll try to write a little bigger, thanks. When one makes a universal claim based on a sample that is either too small or biased. Okay, hasty generalization. So hasty means to do something too quickly, and generalization is a word that stands for an all statement. So that's what a universal claim is. If I say to you, for example, all dogs go to heaven, that's a generalization about dogs. It's saying every single one, not just most, not just some, but all of them go to heaven. Now, the thing about generalizations, though, is that for you to make a generalization, to make a universal statement, you need extraordinarily powerful evidence, because a general claim like that is saying that every single member of that category has this feature. For you to make a general claim, then you need extraordinarily powerful evidence. And so this fallacy is committed when you jump too quickly to a generalization based on a limited amount of available evidence. So here are some examples from the book. Suppose that someone has had a couple of bad experiences in their life with men. And here's the example written. My father was an abuser. Then I had a boyfriend in high school, and he was abusive. So therefore, what's the conclusion? I'll get to you, Chris, in a minute there. I see your question about the written statement of this, but I want to get this question on the table first. My father was an abuser. I had a high school boyfriend. He was abusive to me. Therefore what? Is this hasty generalization conclusion, let's suppose, if you followed my discussion there. When one makes a universal claim based on a sample that is either too small or biased. Okay, good, Veronica, you're helping out Chris. You can refer to the written typed version there if you see it, Chris, but I still have my question for everybody. That is this. Suppose this is the example that I'm giving from our book, really, of hasty generalization. My father was an abuser. My high school boyfriend was an abuser. And therefore, conclusion. What is the conclusion of this hasty generalization? Let's see what you have. I don't think it's too hard. All men are abusive. Good, Madison, yes. So this is based off of 2 experiences with 2 men. And fair enough, Maybe those are bad experiences in this example. But it's not necessarily enough to make the universal generalization about every single man. Not all men are abusers, but some of them are. You can't judge every man based on those couple cases. You know, and that's something that can happen quite broadly with all types of groups. You might have had an example where you said, oh, here was one person of a given religion that was a fundamentalist who committed terrorism. And so therefore, I've seen that happen once or twice, so every member of that religion is like a terrorist or something. That would be a hasty generalization as well, and it's certainly not supported by any honest assessment of how people live their lives and what they believe and what they want to do in their life. How about this? A college education is a great, so here's a statement that was made in the book. A college education is the great equalizer when it comes to class. I can name several people, including Oprah Winfrey, Starbucks founder Howard Schultz, and the founder of Excel, Kenny Trout, who came from very poor families, but then put themselves through college and went on to become billionaires. So what's the claim here? That anybody can make it, because there are 3 people mentioned here that went from, you know, rags to riches, from being poor to being billionaires. But just based on 3 cases, I don't know if it establishes the general principle that everybody can do the same. In fact, there are significant obstacles to social mobility in our country and in other places too, even though there's always exceptions to that. And it says here, the statement is a hasty generalization based on only a handful of outdated cases. In fact, while 77% of young people from rich families graduate from college, only 9% from poor families earn a college degree, thus intensifying the gap between the rich and poor, which is currently at a 30-year high. So anytime you make a generalization, you got to make sure that you have a sufficiently large and unbiased sample. For example, suppose that someone thought, when I was in college, my friends were conservative, and so I think that young people are just conservative, all of them. Well, if the person has self-selected their friends, that might reflect their own political sensibilities and priorities, right? So just judging from their self-selected sample, it might be a biased sample that doesn't really reflect the broader patterns of ideological affiliation in the society at large. And I see here, John, now you say, my question from before, are the fallacies of division and composition related to hasty generalization? Okay, and also Veronica, that they don't have to go to school to be a billionaire. Well, that's also possible if you're very fortunate, but education does open a lot of doors. You'd have to be, I think, very well placed and fortunate in life to be able to skate through and get a lot of money without any kind of formal education. But of course, it can happen, and we've seen some cases like that. Anyways, John, good question. Now, the similarity that I can tell you is between hasty generalization and composition. It's not really between division, because division says the whole class of a certain type has a feature, so each member has that same feature. The conclusion of division is about an individual, not about the whole. But the conclusion about composition is about the whole. It says the parts have this property, so the whole thing has this feature. You could argue that that looks like a hasty generalization, because if somebody said, you know, one white person was racist, so all white people are racist, it kind of makes it look like it's a composition fallacy. And I'm not going to be too picky about distinguishing the 2 categories, fallacy of composition from hasty generalization. But if you really want to get into the details, here's how they differ. Composition is about a part-whole relationship. It says, here's a part of something, and the larger whole has the same attribute that the part has. So the clearest cases of composition are when there are part-whole relations being mentioned. Like if I say to you that the cells in my body are not visible to the naked eye, therefore my body is not visible to the naked eye. In that case, the parts of my body are the cells, the body is the composite formed by them, but of course the composite that is formed by the parts is visible to the naked eye, unlike the individual parts. So the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Hasty generalization does not necessarily imply a part-whole relationship. It more emphasizes a hasty judgment based on limited sample size and evidence. So it's like when your experience of a thing is limited and you judge too quickly that all those things are the same way. Composition is more germane to the topic of things that are built out of parts. But since there is a little bit of looseness at the margins of how these 2 concepts are defined, I would not be too picky in terms of distinguishing them from one another for your work. Now, John, you say this. In the case of division, could this be considered hasty generalization? People of group X generally have trait Y. Person Z is part of group X. Conclusion, person Z has trait Y. Right, well, I see what you're saying. The first premise of your example, John, is that people of group X generally have trait Y. Now, that premise by itself could be the conclusion of a different hasty generalization fallacy. Like, for example, basing the concept of an entire group on a limited number of people from that group. So I could imagine that the first premise of the example you write there, John, is something that could be derived from a hasty generalization. But the format of the example overall, with the two premises leading to that conclusion, is a case of division. How do people arrive at beliefs in terms of stereotypes? They do so usually on the basis of hasty generalizations, and those are fallacious ways to reason. Chris, I see you just have question marks written down. I'm not sure what that is about. You have to state a question in a fulsome way so I can understand what the question would be. Veronica, you write, my grandma speaks Spanish, my dad speaks Spanish, therefore I speak Spanish. Perhaps that's a hasty generalization if we just assume that members of the entire family do. But no, I'm sorry. You're giving an example of division, like, I think, because the conclusion is about one person. Let's not be confused, Veronica. The conclusion of a hasty generalization is not about one person. That's a division example. The conclusion of hasty generalization is about an entire category of things, whether it's people, whether it's some other specified category that things can fall under. But you're not actually fluent. Well, I guess that's something that does match, that if a person was going to assume that you were just because all your family does, then that would be a case of division. All right, so John, therefore fallacies of composition are often hasty generalization, but not necessarily division. Yeah, division, I don't think you could really, don't misunderstand division as having much to do with either hasty generalization or composition. Let's keep those separate in our mind. Division is quite different from both of the others, but composition and hasty generalization are somewhat similar. Okay, good. Cool. So then, let us continue. We've talked about hasty generalization. Anyway, when you make a generalized claim, make sure that you're basing it on an extremely large and unbiased, up-to-date sample. Then you might be in a position to make a fair-minded and rational general claim. Okay? So two more. One more now. It's called straw man. And I'm just going to put the other one here too. Red herring. Okay, so first of all, the straw man. Straw man fallacy happens when you distort or misrepresent an opponent's argument to make it seem like it's easier to refute. Okay? Okay, I wrote it down. I'm going to read it back. It says, this is straw man, when you distort or misrepresent someone's argument to make it seem easier to refute or to reject. Okay, so sometimes when a person gives an argument to somebody else and then this other person does not agree with the conclusion, they can sometimes misrepresent the original person's argument so that it sounds ridiculous or over-exaggerated and therefore easily rejected. So, for example, suppose that somebody says this: we need to practice this social distancing for a while because if we rush back to work too quickly, this is going to cause a bigger public health emergency. So there's my argument. Now, person B, who hears that argument and does not agree, they say this: well, let me understand what you're saying. that we should completely stop the economy permanently, that means that we are never going to have any jobs and we're going to have complete economic collapse. But is that what the person really said, that we should never reopen the economy? No. They just said that we should do it for some time period until it's safe. But now their opponent has distorted their original claim so as to make it seem really out of line and way too extreme. And now another example. Somebody says, I think that we need to get our greenhouse gas emissions under control because it's causing global temperatures to increase, and that's a problem. Now the other person says this, but hold on. If you say we should stop all energy production, then that's going to destroy and cripple our economy, and we'll never recover from that. What's the problem, though? Did the first person say that we should completely eliminate all energy production? No. They just said that we should modify some of our practices and maybe reduce some of those emissions. So they've been mischaracterized by their opponent as saying something way more extreme. What if somebody said, look, I think that the concept of a border wall is costly and ineffective, and that's why I think that it's not a good idea. And then somebody else says, but hold on, if we don't have any borders at all, then our country is just going to be overrun and we won't have any ability to determine who gets to come in and not. But the first person didn't say that there should be no border controls or protocols, merely that a wall wasn't the best way to achieve those goals or outcomes. So we're not supposed to distort or overhype or exaggerate or oversimplify our opponent's argumentative position. You're supposed to take them in the best, most charitable light. Let them give the argument and understand it in its full, correct sense. Don't try to modify the understanding of it so that it sounds really, really weird and off. Let me give you this example from the book. The person says, I don't think that we should legalize same-sex marriage because those people, same-sex marriage advocates, want to replace traditional marriage with gay marriage and make that normal and make heterosexual marriage illegal. Now, obviously, that's not really the position in favor of same-sex marriage, to abolish or eliminate opposite-sex marriage. So attributing that view to the advocate for marriage equality is to misrepresent their viewpoint. And that would be a straw man as well. Let's see. This person says, genetically modified crops should be regulated. And then their opponent says, what? If we don't grow crops, we're all going to starve. But did the first person really say, let's stop growing crops completely? No. They said specifically, let us try and restrict or modify the production of a specific type of commercial agriculture that is genetically modified. So anytime that you distort a person's position, you are committing the straw man fallacy. If somebody says, look, I think that, let me think of another policy issue. Okay, somebody says, marijuana is not the most dangerous of all the federally prohibited drugs. I think that should be legalized or at least decriminalized so that we can reduce the prison population. Okay, now what would be the straw man response to that argument from the opponent? Opponent hears that. Let's change our policies concerning cannabis or whatever. And the opponent now is going to give a straw man response, which would be what? What could that be? If you follow the definition here, then let's see if you can put together a straw man response to this advocate for decriminalization of marijuana. What would be the straw man reply? You heard what the original argument was, right? The person said, marijuana is not as dangerous and addictive, and I think that we have overpopulation in the prison system, so that should be decriminalized. Now, what's the straw man fallacy in response to that argument? So here's what so let me get you straight. You're saying, and then they attribute to the person what? So you want to let people get high anytime they want, jobs, go to work, go to school, keep a family together. That's going to invite chaos. So your argument's crazy. But the person didn't really say that. They just said there's this one particular drug that should be reconsidered in terms of what the policies are. And so you have here, just looking at your comments, you say, I think it's nitpicking an argument and only taking what works for the response. Well, it's not. I wouldn't even say that. It's not really nitpicking because it's totally mischaracterizing the original person's view. The person maybe didn't say something as extreme as that or something as overly simple as that. So when you report on their view as though they did say that, you're getting them wrong and you're making it seem like they're saying something that's beyond what they really said. Now, here's a point I want to mention. It's called straw man for a reason. That's supposed to involve a metaphor. So a straw man could be thought of as like a scarecrow, okay? And what is a scarecrow, literally? It's when you're on a farm, you build a scarecrow so that it scares away crows that would maybe come and like harm your crops, right? They think this scarecrow straw man is a real man, but he's not real. Now, it's a metaphor because when you make a straw man fallacy, you're not replying to the actual person's argument. You're creating an alternative version of their argument and you're replying to that. So instead of replying to what they really said, you kind of create this like zombie version of what they said. That's the straw man. And now you're attacking the straw man instead of the actual person's argument. So straw man's supposed to give you the idea of like some decoy different version of the argument that's not the real one. And you're supposed to reply to their actual argument, not this, you know, exaggerated or distorted version that you've created. Okay. Now, last but not least, it's red herring. Okay, and just quickly go over red herring. Red herring is when you try to distract the argument by bringing up a different unrelated topic. Okay, red herring. It says there, when you try to distract an argument by bringing up a different unrelated issue or topic. So think about an exchange like this between two people. Person A says, we got global warming under control. That's one of the biggest crises that our planet is facing. And person B says, no way, that's false, because have you looked at terrorism? I mean, that's the real problem. Now, what's the matter with this response? Well, it's changing the subject completely from the original person's discussion topic, which is global warming, climate change, to his second issue, which doesn't have anything to do with it, and that's terrorism. So is there anything about saying terrorism is a bad problem that eliminates or invalidates the original claim that global warming is problematic? No. It's just saying here's a different problem, but that doesn't disqualify or undermine the first claim. Like if, for example, someone came up to you and slapped you, and you're like, what are you doing? You can't slap me. What if they said to you, but come on, I mean, some people will just shoot at people just randomly and kill them. I didn't do that. That's way worse. So don't tell me I did something wrong. That's a red herring, because we're not talking about what other people might have done when it comes to like homicide. We're just talking about the one example of what you have done right now, which is wrong enough in and of itself. Some other examples. Why are you so mad at me for driving after I've had a few drinks? I mean, it's no big deal. Do you see how many people drive and text? I mean, they do that all the time. So there's no wrong problem with driving and drinking. Now, that's certainly a red herring. Yes, there's a problem with drinking and driving. Is it also dangerous to text and drive? Sure. But that doesn't, show that there was nothing wrong with the other issue or with the other problem. Sometimes, like we have double standards when it comes to what other countries do and what we do. So someone may say, America has a problem with mass incarceration. There's too many people in the prisons. We're incarcerating more people than almost any other developed nation, and we're spending a lot of money to keep them there. That's a waste of money, and it's not good policy. And somebody else says, yeah, but come on, it's not that bad. Have you looked at what they do in other places around the world? I mean, they just torture and kill people for nothing. You don't even get a trial. So don't tell me we have a problem. That's a red herring, because we're not talking about what the other countries are doing or what their deficiencies are with respect to their laws. We're talking about our own, so they're separate issues. So you're not supposed to basically change topics. Last thing I'm going to say to you about red herring, to help you remember it better. There's also a visual metaphor that has to do with red herring that gives it the name. Okay, so if you were a hunter, there's this method of training hunting dogs that you go out with, like bloodhounds and foxhounds. If you want them to retrieve, let's say you shoot at a pheasant 100 yards out there, and now you ask the dog to go fetch it and bring it back to you, right? Now, to make these dogs really good at that, they would train them by these red herrings. So a herring is actually a very smelly little fish. And these fish would distract the dog from its target to run off at a tangent. So what they would do is they would place these herrings all along diagonal tangent lines away from the direct line ahead to where the pheasant would be. And they wanted to see, is the dog going to get thrown off and distracted by the scent of the herring so that it deviates from its course? Or is it going to be so well trained over time that it ignores the red herrings and it just goes straight to the intended target? So that is a metaphor, right? It's not that we're chasing after a pheasant in the field and being distracted by these little fish, but analogously, when we're on a topic of discussion or debate, we're not supposed to be distracted or thrown off by other side issues that could be brought in. We're supposed to direct ourselves back toward the main theme or line of discussion and argument. And whenever we deviate from that, we commit the red herring fallacy. Okay, so let me make it very clear again to you. You have a homework that's due this Thursday, next class. You have to just send it to me through the email attachment like you did with the midterm. And the 8 fallacies that we've learned today, so personal attack, scare tactic, appeal to pity, popular appeal, appeal to ignorance, hasty generalization, straw man, red herring. Those are the 8 things that are used to fill in the answers for the homework. It's not the ones that we learned last Thursday. It's not the ones that we will learn this Thursday. So today's lesson is sole sufficient for you to fill out that homework. And for the homework, right, you just have to say the name of the fallacy. You don't have to write the whole example. Just say the name of the fallacy that occurs in that letter. And if there's no fallacy, as there are in a couple cases, none, then you would just write none for that response. Okay, so yeah, confusing, tricking a wild goose chase probably, yes, it would probably be confusing to the dog, but if they're well trained enough, then they'll be fine. It's due on Thursday. It's been mentioned in previous Canvas notification, but just check it there if you want any more feedback or insight into how to complete it. It's due Thursday, this Thursday. So I'm talking about 2 days from now. Yeah, so that's when I'll get it back. So the 8 we learned today, they're the ones on the homework. That's correct, Chris, yes. Not the others, just the 8 from today. So it sort of simplifies it down a little bit. Your answer for any one of A through Z is the name of one of these 8 things or the words no fallacy, okay? All right, guys, well, I think we've run to the end, so have a great day. Hope you're all doing really well and staying healthy and safe. So far, I can tell you I haven't had any student report to me like a serious illness or anything, and so I think that's good news. But let's keep it that way if we can. Take care, and I will see you guys on Thursday at the next live stream. Don't forget to do your homework then, okay? Thank you.